With civil unrest on the rise just about everywhere, we're seeing an increase in protests all over the show. From Canada to Europe to New Zealand, people are currently taking to the streets to protest COVID-19 restrictions. And it wasn't long before this that we saw millions coming together to express support for the Black Lives Matter movement. No matter the cause, a whole lot of us are pissed off with the state of our lives, our governments, and our countries. Let's look at protesting, what it can achieve, under what conditions it should be allowed, and how important it is in a free society. Since the formation of governments, protesting has been a favorite pastime of people everywhere. Our reasons for protesting particular issues stem from a variety of ideological leanings, but nearly all protests begin because of something a government, institution, or individual did or did not do, which caused widespread dissatisfaction amongst people. We protest to show our discontent for wars, tax increases, civil rights violations, lack of action on climate change, and in some cases, because we weren't happy with the outcome of a democratic process. Throughout the 60s and early 70s, people came together in the US and abroad to protest America's involvement in the Vietnam War, with the Iraq War seeing similar dissatisfaction amongst the global populace only a few decades later. Around 25,000 French folk took to the streets in 2005 in order to push back against police brutality and wealth inequality, which erupted in violence and the arson of over 8,000 vehicles. Here in New Zealand, we saw a crowd of over 170,000 gather in the capital city to protest climate change inaction late 2019, leading the government to promptly sit tight and assess. Sometimes a good protest will effectively put pressure on leaders to make the changes being demanded by the people. Other times, a protest is nothing more than a cool place to hang out with like-minded individuals, which isn't a bad thing, but it just isn't conducive to political change. An effective protest needs organization, ideological consistency, and strong leadership. Without these things, a protest has little means of sustaining itself and affecting the desired political change. Take the Occupy Wall Street protests, for example. Due to their unclear demands and a lack of strong leadership, a message against wealth inequality that many of us would probably agree with was easily twisted by the media to make the protesters look like nothing more than angry and confused predominantly white college students with little idea of how they would achieve the vague goals they were pushing for. Though there may be some truth to that, Occupy Wall Street began an important conversation that's no less relevant today. The same could be said for the Black Lives Matter protests. When George Floyd was murdered in the streets for the whole world to bear witness, people were rightfully angry at the flagrant display of police brutality, which sparked an international wave of protests supporting BLM. While many of the protests may have started as a reaction to Floyd's death and the general disparate treatment of minorities in America, the movement also became about sparking a much bigger conversation about state violence everywhere. Unfortunately, the powerful message of BLM fell victim to the same issues we saw with Occupy Wall Street, with the media on both sides, but especially on the right, portraying the movement as violent and unreasonable. The slogan, "Defund the police," became infamous thanks to the many political commentators and the president himself, conflating the slogan with, "Let's have more crime," when what most of them meant by that was, let's reallocate some of the public funds currently feeding a disgustingly overbloated police budget towards maybe some social workers who are less likely to respond to someone's mental health episode with bullets. But by the time people believe the mainstream narrative, it is difficult to convince them otherwise, which is why clear messaging is essential when leading protests. In fact, the media will almost always distort the message of a protest to suit their own needs. You know, fake news and what have you.
That is a lot of fake news back there. That's a lot.
The media rarely sides with protesters in any context, making it essential that organizers of modern protests can manage their own public relations messaging. The media doesn't care what you're protesting. They care about driving engagement, so organizers will not only need to get out ahead with their own messaging, but they'll need to combat each narrative coming from media outlets on either side of the political aisle. But we also often see the opposite tendency when it comes to protests led by minority voices, especially those of indigenous people. A group of Native Americans protesting an oil pipeline going through their sacred land just doesn't make for a juicy story. So it is less often that we'll see their voices portrayed in the media. It is also less often that we'll hear about the state violence these groups are subjected to, because go figure. Now, there's something neat about protesting in democracies. It's a right. In the United States, citizens are granted the right to protest under the Constitution's First Amendment, which reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or exhibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." We have a similar, less wordy version of the same thing here, outlined in Section 16 of the 1990 New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. Everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. All other liberal democracies have their own versions of the right to protest, which means these guys had the right to protest. And these folks. And yes, even these folks.
If you're being vaccinated, you need to be aware that you have been but you may have been injected with something that creates your body to make these evil little invisible parasites called spike proteins.
Many of us have lost sight of the fact that clear detachment from reality doesn't negate one's right to protest. No matter how ridiculous or unhinged a protest may seem, it isn't about the cause. It's about the right to protest being upheld. Because if the government can decide who is and isn't allowed to protest, they won't allow anyone to protest anything. Even protests led by people with abhorrent views should be allowed to do so that the public can judge their ideas for themselves. The white supremacist march in Charlottesville, Virginia, for example, at first glance might be a terrible thing that no decent person would want to see in their town. However, after the disastrous rally that resulted in the death of one person and injuring of many more, the broader public saw the protest for what it was. A bunch of unstable and cringy Nazis throwing a tantrum because a statue of their favorite slave-owning general was taken down. This irreparably damaged the reputations of the movement and its organizers, ruining their careers and causing them to lose much of their momentum and support. Auf Wiedersehen, Nazis! Now, many of us will probably assume that the bigger the protest, the bigger the political change brought about by said protest. However, size doesn't matter. It's how you use it. In response to the inauguration of Donald Trump, over 450,000 people joined the Women's March in Washington, D.C., making it the largest single-day protest in U.S. history. The organizers stated that their goal with the march was to send a bold message to our new administration on their first day in office, and to the world that women's rights are human rights. Seeing as this message was targeted towards the Trump administration, it was ignored entirely. Though the march was formed around a noble goal, there was little tangible pressure placed on leaders that would change the way that they chose to govern. An opposite example is the movement started by the Black Panther Party. The Black Panthers were a left-wing group of only around 5,000 members who came into the national spotlight in May of 1967 when a small group of its members marched fully armed into the California State Legislature in Sacramento. They were emboldened by the view that African Americans had a right to bear arms under the Second Amendment of the Constitution. The Black Panther Party marched in to protest against the pending Mulford Act, which was a gun control law designed to stop the Black Panthers from patrolling their communities, where they followed police in order to hold them accountable after numerous instances of police brutality. Though the bill did end up passing, they managed to command a strong media presence, sending a powerful message to the nation. And in addition to leading the protests, the Black Panthers also used their resources to serve their communities, and began a breakfast program for children, a food bank, and other social services to empower the poorest lower-class residents. They were pretty cool folks. Now, even though we all have a God-given right to protest, there often does come a point when things need to cool off. In the case of a violent protest, a government response will be needed almost immediately, and in the case of a peaceful one, eventually even sympathetic locals will get sick of the crowds and demand a response. But what can be considered an acceptable method of breaking up a protest? Perhaps this method that was deployed against the civil rights protesters. Or perhaps the Chinese state did it right with the Hong Kong protests. Or perhaps New Zealand had it right with the recent vaccine mandate protests, using the most brutal and authoritarian anti-protest measures the world has yet seen. It isn't unreasonable that the government would eventually need to end a protest, but too often this involves inflicting a great deal of harm towards their own citizens. While this is obviously not ideal for people who like having eyes and intact skulls, it is ideal for the movement as a whole, thanks to phones. The ability to film any police response has dramatically changed the power dynamic between the state and protesters, who can now put their actions on display for the whole world to see. This makes it much harder to hide the extreme violence inflicted by law enforcement, and often helps the movement garner sympathy from the wider public. Protesting is an important tool for us citizens to use in order to leverage our power over government when it isn't enacting the will of the people. Voting often isn't enough to hold government accountable, and an organized protest with clear messaging and strong leadership has the ability to make a much more powerful statement than a ballot ever could. If our governments aren't acting on our behalf, we in democracies have the right to gather in force and push back against it. We should never take our rights for granted, and we should always exercise them when we deem it necessary. Keep resisting, keep making your voice be heard, and keep being excellent to each other.